Hello and welcome to the Auditing Antics podcast. So today we have Sean Weiss back with us. So Sean, second time on the podcast.
Hello.
Thank you. And our good friend Eric. Hi, Eric.
Hey, how are you?
Wait. Why do I get introduced as? Wait a minute.
Okay,
wait.
Sean, you're also a good friend.
Yeah, I was going
to clarify.
I was just about to say, wait a minute. Sean's back for the second time, and here's our good friend Eric, as if to say, it's just Sean.
Well, and I should say our good friend Eric, and I'm only friends with Eric through you. So thank you for that, Sean.
So you're not even real friends.
Introducing to your friends.
That is true.
It's been a long time since Eric and I have been together on a podcast. We'll see if it stays on the rails or not.
Yeah, definitely. Well, hopefully so. We'll see. A little bit of comedy.
Yeah,
all right.
I really like that intro. It was like early '90s rock. I mean, it was like
yes.
It was like one step above yacht rock.
Yes,
yacht
exactly.
rock.
We can't go all out with the metal here, Eric. So we have to keep it tame a little bit.
I'm so obsessed with yacht rock now. I can't even stand myself. To the chagrin of many around me, I can't stop listening. I can't stop listening. All right, I digress.
You're okay. So today we're going to be diving in and talking about some specifics related to what happens to practices when these external audits come in. And, one thing that I'm finding a lot of my clients dealing with, and Sean, I know you and I've dealt with this a lot over the years, is they're getting in situations where they feel stuck because what a payer's coming in and saying doesn't always have a policy behind it, for example. And everything they're doing to try to fight back against it is not working. So they're stuck either in prepayment reviews, or I talked with someone last week, for example, that's going through a situation where every single time they bill a particular CPT code, it's always denied. And every single time they just basically send back, a templated denial appeal letter saying, this is why you should be paying it. Show us why you're not. So, Sean, I know you and I've been talking about some of what you're dealing with right now. If you want to jump into that related to kind of this catch-22 we find ourselves in.
Yeah, listen, the new administration, there's no doubt they've taken a sledgehammer to the healthcare industry. They are extremely aggressive with ferreting out fraud, waste, and abuse, which I applaud. But I also, at the same time, caution those at the Department of Health and Human Services from overreach. When you go on a mass process of identification of potential waste, fraud, and abuse, you also run the risk of dragging into your investigations innocent providers who, based on pure blind data mining, may be inappropriately looked at and pushed into a prepayment situation. I have a situation. I have a tale of two U-picks that I could share with you. Right. On one hand, I have the U-pick that I'm dealing with. I'm going to refrain from mentioning their region or who they are for obvious reasons. And I will say this: I'm very proud of the relationships that I've been able to build with not only investigators, but directors, program directors, and those who really take the lead at the U-pick in a lot of ways. And it's been really nice to be able to build those relationships from something where somebody said to me, I know you, but it's only by name and by reputation. And this is the first time we're getting to engage together. And it's been nothing but a fantastic relationship working through this U-pick investigation for this provider. On the other hand, I have a U-pick that not only took a sledgehammer, I mean, they hammered it, if that's even a word. This group into complete bankruptcy. They literally put them onto a Medicare payment suspension without notice, without any formal discussion period, which is required. They literally just shut them down. More than $700,000 in outstanding money due this organization, who legitimately billed for these services. And I know that it was legitimate because I've worked with this group for almost a decade, and I monitor their regulatory compliance with external counsel. So here on one hand, we have a UPIC that disregarded Medicare policy, disregarded the process, took a sledgehammer and beat them into bankruptcy. And on the other hand, we have a UPIC who said, help us help you to figure out how we move this investigation along and how we bring it to an amicable conclusion. And you know, the last thing that I'll say, and I think, Eric, you and I share this same sentiment on this, right? So many people misunderstand what UPICs are. UPICs are not like RACs. They're not the MACs. These are investigational entities. These organizations conduct data analytics that lead to investigations. And as part of that investigation, audits are just a portion of what they do. These are bona fide investigations that have significant consequences, such as referrals to the Office of Inspector General, referrals to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, by which they require, you know, they suggest payment suspension or prepayment review. And I think people need to really get on board and understand the gravity of receiving a letter from a UPIC to avoid making mistakes, such as ignoring it to the last minute or failing to get somebody competent like Eric or Stephanie or myself involved at the very onset of the letter being received, rather than waiting until the 11th hour or until the UPIC has issued a results letter.
Yeah, and you know, that's one thing too, Eric. I hear from a lot of people that, you know, when they get notifications, they don't know what these things mean, right?
Right.
So when we talk a lot about different divisions, different units, different entities. On the commercial side, I'm always looking for that SIU notification for that special investigative unit.
Right.
But, you know, one thing that is really difficult is that a lot of the times when we come up against these types of cases and issues, we're not finding practices, to Sean's point, that have ill intent, right?
Right.
There may be an issue. There
Right.
may not even be that big of an issue, but some of it can definitely be led by the data analytics. But you know, from your perspective, with your prior work in the government and now working heavy in the SIU side, you know, what are your thoughts related to those initial phases when someone's being identified and starting to probe in and take a look?
Yeah, I mean, you know, first and foremost, I think, you know, the thing that I tout, and Sean and I have talked about this in our, you know, we have our old podcast, the Coffee Compliance and Chuckleheads, my podcast, the OIG Roundtable conversation we have. And even just as recently as the other day, there was a conversation on LinkedIn where they continue to use the word audit vis-a-vis a UPIC matter. And, you know, I can't stress enough, and Sean and I talk about this online, offline. It becomes a topic of conversation. When the UPIC sends you a request for records, it is not an audit. They are not doing an audit. It is an investigational inquiry that could lead to a number of things. It could lead to a referral back to the Medicare Administrative Contractor, the MAC, for targeted probe and education, for TPE. It could lead to an administrative recovery by them if they don't think that there's a credible allegation of fraud. If they believe there's a credible allegation of fraud from the data, from whatever else, it could lead to a referral to OIG. By the way, credible allegation of fraud is a very open-ended definition. You can find it in the CFR, but it's kind of it's a little bit of a cornucopia of things that create what that credible allegation is. It could be data, it could be it's a number of things. But I really think that the baseline that we have to have is that UPICs do not conduct audits. SIUs do not conduct audits. And I think we have to get it out there in the industry that when you are talking about an audit, you are not talking about a UPIC inquiry, an SIU inquiry. It is different. These are the definition of an SIU is Special Investigations Unit. It is not Special Auditing Department, SAD, which is sometimes what it is. It's an investigation. The goal of an SIU, and really if we're talking about UPICs, the goal of a UPIC is to right the wrong, right? Whatever that definition of the wrong is. And we're not here to make an assessment. But at the end of the day, providers need to understand that when a letter from a UPIC comes in or a letter from an SIU comes in, something has triggered them to say the cream has risen to the top, and it needs to be addressed. And I think that the absolute number one thing is that at the end of the day, the results of that investigation can lead to an overpayment, nothing, a referral to law enforcement. And I think that's where, when you get right down to the fraud, waste, abuse, I've been using FWAC, compliance, because at the end of the day, if you have a viable, living, breathing, effective compliance program in place, then none of this should become as a surprise when an audit or an investigation are your way, because it's just a matter of not if, it's a matter of when. And more importantly is that in the world of data analytics, we're seeing more and more cases are being drummed up proactively. Data analytics is a proactive methodology. Complaints, hotlines, all of that are reactive. Whistleblowers are reactive. Data analytics is the driving factor behind a lot of cases now. And more importantly is, outliers. So, I just got contacted the other day, and I know, Sean, we've talked about this a million times. Provider's a hospitalist, billed for more number of hours in the day, whatever that threshold was. This wasn't even 24 hours. It was a lower number. And I went back to the defense attorney that, that's retaining us. And I said, where did they come up with this threshold? Like it's an arbitrary, they billed for more than 15 hours, 16, whatever this is. Where'd they come up with that? Right. And so, and in the world of medical decision-making now, you're inherently an outlier based on time, when time isn't even the determining factor anymore. So it's like, and the crazy part is now I've seen a number of these cases where the U.S. Attorney's Office, Department of Justice, they go to the provider and they say, you're an outlier. You billed for more than 15 hours a day for 100 days, and your overpayment is $1 million. And so I go to the defense attorney and I say, $1 million. Is $1 million the delta? Did they do a record review? Did they identify that these aren't level 5s, they're level 3s? Is the overpayment $1 million because that's the delta between what they were paid and what they should have been paid? Is that the net overpayment, which is what you should be doing in a statistically valid random sampling? Or are they saying you owe us $1 million because we've determined that you billed for more than X number of hours in a day? And you don't really get an answer. What you get is the U.S. attorneys or the government coming back and saying, well, you give us a number that you think is what the overpayment is. And, I just talked to a defense attorney the other day, and I said, and she's a former AUSA, and I said, in what world is it the defendant's burden to prove the negative, or to, where is this coming? So, the thing really comes down to, and I know I've rambled a little bit, but the thing that it really comes down to is, if you've got all of your ducks in a row and you have an effective compliance program, which doesn't mean that your auditing manager is auditing the work of the auditing team or the coding team. And by the way, auditors and coders are not the same. And anybody who says that they audit in the practice, and I say, well, what do you do? And they go, well, I look, and if it's a level 5 and it should be a level 3, I recode it. I said, well, that's not auditing, that's coding. But you need to have an effective compliance program. You need to have a third party come in and do it. You need to have all of these ducks in a row, but really understand that when a letter comes from an SIU, a letter comes from a UPIC, these are not routine. There's nothing routine about it. Something has triggered you to rise to the top, and it needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed immediately. I don't know how many times Sean has said to me, hey, you're not going to believe this. I just got a request to help someone. They have an SIU or a UPIC investigative letter, and we have to turn the records over tomorrow, and they let me know yesterday.
Yeah.
You know, a couple of things real quick, Stephanie, before you go on, you know, I want to unpack. You know, Eric brings up a great point about the SIU, the Special Investigative Unit. These are for the commercial payers, if you're not familiar with them. Keep in mind that commercial payers can make referrals just as easy to the Office of the Inspector General or to the Department of Justice, the same way that a government entity can. As you guys know, I'm an investigator for a composite medical board, and I can't tell you how many times, you know, during the course of a month, I receive what's called an SIU packet. And that SIU packet starts off with predictive analytic data, right? Where they've identified a provider based on either aberrance or their outlier status. They did some type of random audit. Whether it's statistically valid or not isn't really a question for me at that point. And then there's investigations such as, you know, the review of documentation, the review of agreements, interviews with stakeholders at the practice, excuse me, and or patients. And then I get the package. My job for the composite medical board is to review it to make a determination as to whether or not there was a potential violation in the code of ethics for those providers, and then to make a determination as to whether or not I refer them upward to the entire medical board, or whether I make a determination on, you know, how it should be handled. But I will tell you, the SIUs are extremely aggressive. Eric, you have a lot of experience with SIUs. You know, their job is to ferret out fraud, waste, and abuse. But the thing that I love that you said is something that I've been saying for probably a decade now. And that is, you have to have a culture of compliance within your organization. And a culture of compliance isn't just the production of a 3-ring binder or a PDF of an electronic document with a bunch of words on it. You know, when Stephanie and I worked at a large group together, a large rheumatology group years ago, we had general counsel. And one of the things that he and I had a great conversation about was, look, we can build a comprehensive compliance program without it being hundreds of pages. We can literally scale this to what we know to be relevant within the practice. Look at the 8 elements of a compliance program. Everybody says 7, but Eric, we know there's 8, right? Which is the risk assessment. But the last thing that I always said, and I've been saying this for a decade, in order for a compliance program to be a bona fide compliance program, it has to be a living, breathing document. That means it's not a paperweight. It's not a document that lives on your desktop that occasionally, meaning every 3 to 4 years, you open up and go, oh, I should change this version from version 1 to version 1.2. You know, it has to be a living, breathing document where you're actually auditing, you know, and this is the last thing I'll say before you move on. When you look at one of the 7 steps, right, in the original OIG compliance guidance document that was produced in 2000, one of those steps is auditing and monitoring. Well, auditing and monitoring isn't referring to auditing and monitoring of your evaluation and management services codes or your procedure codes or the use of biologics or, you know, DME. Auditing and monitoring for the Office of Inspector General means that you are auditing and monitoring the efficacy of your compliance program to ensure that you are maintaining compliance with current acts, statutes, laws, regulations, etc., to the point where, you know, I tell people all the time, being from the South, for me, it's all about meat and potatoes. You could keep your rabbit food for somebody else. For me, the potatoes is the starch, is the compliance plan itself, right? Because it's a static document. It's not going to change unless there's some type of significant structural change to the organization, or we see some kind of incredible change within the federal government requirements for maintaining compliance. The meat of every single corporate compliance program has to be the policies, your policies and your procedures, because when somebody knocks on your door, like Eric, when you were an OIG agent and you went in to conduct an investigation or to interrogate somebody, during an interview, the first thing that you would say to them is, why are you doing things in this manner? Can you explain that to me? And they would say, well, this is how we do it. This is why we do it. And you'd say, show that to me in a written policy or procedure, because just simply saying that this is what we do doesn't hold up in a court of law. There's got to be written policies and procedures. That old saying of, well, we've always done it that way, people got to stop saying that nonsense.
Right. That doesn't.
I just heard it again yesterday. Just last night in a meeting, I heard it again.
Yeah, that doesn't. I don't get that. And when we would issue subpoenas, that's one of the things you put on a subpoena is a copy of your policies and procedures vis-a-vis compliance. And I will tell you now that even when we talk to when I do work with providers, one of the first questions I ask is, do you have a compliance program? Is it written? When was the last time you looked at it? And, it is really amazing to me. So first of all, no matter what anybody wants to say about the Affordable Care Act and any of the things that have been done in the current administration to change it, alter it, or do whatever, the Affordable Care Act, when it was passed in 2010, has a requirement that if you are in the Medicare, Medicaid programs, you must have an effective compliance program. Now, I have never seen anybody get prosecuted.
Right.
Criminally, civilly, administratively. I've never seen OSIG. I've never seen the OIG come in and do anything about it. But at the end of the day, there's clearly a recognition of the importance of having a compliance program. And the one thing I will say is, a few years ago, we were asked to help with a practice that had a UPIC investigation going on, and they were in the New York metro area, and I think they had 6 offices in 4 of the 5 boroughs, or 5 offices in 4 of the 5 boroughs. But this was not a mom and pop practice. They owned buildings in every location but one. These were offices that were open 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, 30 doctors. It was a robust practice. And I remember sitting with the provider, and I said to the owner of the practice, I really think you need to do a cadence of audits. You've got 30 providers. You should be doing 2 or 3 providers a month, a probe sample of 30 records. The provider says, why 30? Well, the program integrity manual from CMS says a probe sample is 20 to 40. We say 30, so you have consistency. We would do that. And, we kind of go through the nuts and bolts. And at the end, the provider says, well, geez, we're just a mom and pop practice. We didn't budget for this. And I was like, unless you're trading chickens for eye exams, like, how are you a mom and pop practice? You have 5 locations open 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, 30 doctors, you have this, that, and the last time I checked, the only person that budgeted for criminality was Al Capone and John Gotti, right? I mean, people aren't normally, right? You're not normally budgeting for criminality. But,
That's right.
What I said was what you're budgeting for is proactive compliance, which is something that you should be doing to create that culture of compliance and being a good corporate citizen. Like, at the end of the day, there's things that you have to do. You can't just say, well, we do this. And I remember vividly holding up one of the provider's super bills where, the ICD-10s, the CPT and HCPCS codes were circled. And I said, well, who does your coding? Oh, I have coders in the back that do it. And I held up the super bill and I said, well, who circles this? And so the doctor does it. So, well, the doctor's coding. Well, the doctors aren't coding. Well, of course they are. The doctor is circling the CPT, the HCPCS code, and the diagnosis. If you have people in the back that are coding, then they're looking at the medical record, they're determining the code, and they're ascribing a code that they think is relevant. And he goes, well, my girls in the back do the code. And I always hate when they say that, my girls in the back. My girls in the back do it. And I say, well, what are they doing? And what they're really doing is the billing. It's a mechanical data entry function. And I said, the people you have working in the back aren't coding. The people in the back aren't auditing. The people in the back are doing nothing more than completing the electronic version of the 1500 to create the 837 file to send off for payment. And I think that that's part of where that disconnect is. But then that disconnect, kind of full circle, that disconnect circles back to this general feeling that when an SIU or a UPIC sends you a letter, it's an audit. And I think as a culture in this industry, people need to get off of that horse of believing that that's the case. And I don't know at what point people change that. Maybe they change that tune when it's an OIG case that came from a UPIC, or it's a large overpayment and a corrective action plan to not get kicked out of the. I don't know when.
Yeah, but Eric, I get this all the time, and Stephanie, I don't want to step on what you were about to say, but Eric, I get this all the time. Even people that have received a letter from the Office of the Inspector General where it says they had 30 charts audited or 100 charts audited, they send it back to me and they go, oh, I had an OIG audit. No, you didn't have an OIG audit. You're under investigation by a law enforcement agency under the purview of the Department of Health and Human Services, who has made the determination that there's probable cause to take a look at the things that you're doing in your organization, either based on credible allegations or data analytics that point to an outlier or aberrance in your coding pattern. So stop. People, you're right. I don't know how much we can continue to say these are not audits, people. If you want to talk about being audited, when a MAC sends you a notice of audit, that's an audit. When you're audited by a recovery audit contractor, that's an audit.
It's all about money at that point. And the thing I do, and I do a lot of these presentations to the AAPC chapters and anybody who wants to listen to me, but I do a whole PowerPoint, presentation on kind of the OIG investigative operations. And what I talk about is the fact that, when people hear the letters OIG, they never think about the fact that there were multiple components of the OIG. I was at the Office of Investigations. I was a federal agent. I carried a badge and gun for a living. I had the same law enforcement training as anybody in the Secret Service, the DEA, all of the traditional, things. Everybody goes to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. We did search warrants. We did arrests. And I think the problem exists is that when there is something that involves OIG, people are always immediately thinking in terms of regulatory, legal, administrative actions, and the interaction of OIG with CMS from a policy perspective. What they don't think is the fact that when you are doing these things, and Eric Rubenstein shows up at your door when I was doing that job, that there was the prospect that my investigation was going to result in a criminal charge based upon, probable cause and indictment or something like that. And I think that, part of that is that people need to understand that the UPICs have a multifocal role, and, they're Unified Program Integrity Contractor. The word audit doesn't appear in the UPIC. When you look at the work that the UPICs do, they're following guidance that comes out of the Program Integrity Manual. There's words like credible allegation of fraud. The F word is the thing that is, where we're talking about intent and malfeasance and those things. And I think that the number one thing that needs to be understood is exactly that. If you're getting a letter from a RAC, a recovery audit contractor, it's really about money. If you're getting something from the MAC, it's about money. It's about repaying the money. And if you're getting something from Office of Counsel to the Inspector General, and you're talking about, a double damages assessment under a CMP, it's about money. It's an administrative action. But there's this very big disconnect in our space, in the FWA compliance space, where when you talk to people about the OIG, the first thing that they think about is, do you have an accounting degree? What kind of audits did you work on? And I go, no, I didn't work on audits. I was a criminal investigator. And so, you kind of have to have these, these conversations have to be bifurcated, where you're talking about, where is the problem versus where's the audit issue, because they're not the same.
Yeah. And I want to go back here a little bit to the point related to people's thoughts in general about when this can occur, or always thinking, oh, it's not going to be me. And, definitely over the past 2 years, we've seen a change in the trends in the way that these investigations are taking place. But I still meet with people continually who constantly think it's not going to be them. They hear the cost of an external audit and what that's going to take to have, this looked into for risk mitigation. And like you were saying, Eric, they didn't budget for it. They don't want to do it. And, with the way that the data analytics is going, I'm finding that it's more and more an investigation versus an audit. I'm seeing more investigations than I am seeing audits.
Right.
And a couple of things. Number one, we really need to make sure that everyone's continuing to talk about the fact that it can happen to anyone. It doesn't matter the size, it doesn't matter what's happening in that practice. When we're just looking at billing data alone, that's going to tell its own story. And, for example, I actually have a good example right now. I'm working through a monitoring project from an internal risk perspective. And one report I requested from the billing data was looking at the levels of service, the low levels of service. And with those outliers, what I'm looking at is frequency issues, documentation issues, the notes not showing specifically enough why that patient needs to be seen. It's not just me looking and saying, oh, these are probably undercoded. I'm finding all of these other issues that exist within those scenarios.
Right.
So, when we have that continued thought that it's not going to be them, what are your thoughts around the way that monitoring is going?
Well, listen,
I'm seeing all kinds of trends now, even to diagnoses, not even just CPT.
Well, listen, I mean, the problem is that for the most part, providers live in a weird place. It's called the state of denial. And I don't know, I've never really seen it myself, but I think it's a real thing. But for me, and I know Sean and I, we talk about this one a lot. When you talk to providers and the provider comes back and says, I don't understand why someone is looking at this, it's not a problem. And my response to those providers is always, is it not a problem because somebody of authority told you that this wasn't a problem? Or is it not a problem because either one, A, you've never been asked to produce documentation for this, or 1B, the guy down the street told you it's not a problem because they're doing it, but they're also living in the state of denial. And I think that's the biggest challenge. And Sean, you deal with the provider community a lot more than I do. And I know we talk about this all the time. And for me, that's the biggest challenge. Is it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when something is going to happen. And, one of the things that we've been talking to internally on our SIU team and a lot of our work is that, I thought for a very long time that diagnosis codes were the redheaded stepchildren of billing and coding, because we always focus on the thing that triggers a payment, which is a CPT or a HCPCS code. But, we've been really working with a lot of our SIU plans and internally on kind of looking at things like, for example, when there's a particular CPT code that is covered under an NCD or an LCD, and the patient needs to have a particular diagnosis in order for it to happen. And the first day that you look in the billing history that they have that diagnosis is the day they get the service. And the one that stands out to me is G0166, enhanced external counterpulsation. People have to have a diagnosed stage 2 or stage 3 non-surgical angina. They have to have a referral from a cardiologist to whoever's doing the ECP. And I've worked on probably 3 or 4 cases involving this, where the first day that the person has the ICD-10 for unstable non-surgical angina is on the day that they get G0166. There's no cardiology history. There's no diagnosis of it. There are no tests. And it's like the state of denial. that the provider has on that. It's like, how do you say that this isn't a problem when you can't even follow the basic rule to get paid for that service?
Well, I will say this, and you could go back in history and probably find 100 times where I've said this. You're not paid based on the CPT code that you bill. You're paid based on the diagnosis, because the diagnosis establishes the medical necessity for the service. The CPT codes, the HCPCS codes, have RVUs assigned to them based on a work, a practice, a malpractice, geographical practice, cost indices, etc. That fee that you're paid, $100, let's just say, for whatever it is, that $100 has nothing to do with what the service was. You're paid because the diagnosis substantiated the claim for remuneration that said you had the specific diagnosis code. I will say this. I think the reason why we always looked at diagnosis codes, and I'm guilty of this up until probably about 5-6 years ago, I always looked at diagnoses as the redheaded stepchild. Like when I was doing the actual audits myself, and I did audits for 25 years. When I did those audits, very rarely did I look at the diagnosis codes, because to me, it wasn't relevant, because in my mind, the documentation was meant to support the billing of the CPT code or the HCPCS level 2 code or the use of a specific modifier. It wasn't until about a decade ago that I started recognizing the fact that, holy crap, you know what? I've been looking at this wrong. They're getting a fee for the performance of the service, but the performance of the service is based on the diagnosis, which establishes the medical necessity for the reason why it was done. And one of the things that Stephanie can tell you, for all of the audits that we do for clients that are asking for prospective reviews to try to get ahead of a potential problem, I've stopped asking for 30 patients, 30 individual dates of service. I think that's just absolute crap. And the reason why, I can fight any organization, I can fight any insurance company, I can fight any investigational organization, because when you pull 30 individual dates of service for 30 random patients, you're looking at those claims in a vacuum. And doctors historically are poor documenters, and they don't give you historical information. So for me, I always tell our clients, let's look at 6 patients, 5 dates of service for each of these patients. Let's start with the initial evaluation so I can see when the diagnosis was actually made. And then I want multiple dates of service after the initial evaluation. Because to me, now I'm getting what's referred to as an episode of care.
Right.
And that episode of care now paints a clear picture for me as an investigator as to whether or not the services that have been billed are relevant.
That's 100% right. And I'll tell you, Sean, what I say all the time is you can't look at an individual patient's individual date of service and think you're getting the story. It's when we do a review, when I look at a review and I say we should be looking at 30 records, I'm saying 30 patients for a cumulative amount of time, a start date and an end date. And the example I love to give, we do a lot of reviews on our SIU side where, for example, we're asking for documentation to support an ancillary service, let's say an office-based ultrasound. And the provider submits the documentation for the ultrasound. My response is that is insufficient, because at the end of the day, all you've done is documented that you did an ultrasound. What you've not done is establish the rationale for the diagnosis that triggered it. And so, when we do some reviews for some of our SIU clients and we have, a denial of 100%, and then the provider appeals and they produce all these other documents, our SIU investigators will call me up and say, Eric, I think these are bogus records. Why do you think they're bogus? Well, they produced all these other documents to support the ultrasound that was done. I go, hold on a minute. When you sent your request letter and the attestation, and the provider signed the attestation saying, I've given you all the records complete for the date of service you asked for, they're not being, it's not disingenuous. I said, but are you asking for the documentation to support the ultrasound? Because the ultrasound in and of itself is a document that they're going to have. But what is the thing that's establishing the medical necessity? We're not talking necessarily clinical. We're talking about documentation, medical necessity, because this is an ongoing argument. Medical necessity in the PIM is not very well defined because there's not really a clinical definition. When we're talking about medical necessity, it's a little bit like an E&M, an office, visit. We're not saying that the patient didn't need the office visit. We're saying that the documentation didn't support this level versus this level. And I go back all the time and I say, when you are requesting medical records, you should be asking for the medical records to support that the thing that you're looking at was done. That's a basic.
Yep.
But you should also be looking at the documentation that surrounds that date of service.
Two things I want to say, right?
It's complete and accurate, right? You want completeness and you want accuracy.
Yep. So two things I want to say. And I want you to go back maybe a couple of years, Eric, to when you had reached out to me, when you actually used to call me and we were friends.
Sean's a little butthurt today.
I know. We always hurt the ones we love. Oh, my
God. I said to you when you told me about you guys, meaning Advise, getting contracts for some of the SIUs and one for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. One of the things that I said to you was, good, because I know you guys will bring integrity and a level of common sense, pragmatism to these organizations that don't necessarily have a clue as to what they're doing. The other thing that bothers me, and this is an allegation that happens all the time, and I shut this thing down. Stephanie will tell you, Stephanie, you and I have worked together for about a decade now?
Yeah.
And you've been long time. And you've been part of a lot of the UPIC investigations that, I was asked to lead and handle. One of the things, to Eric's point, when they would bring up, well, you submitted all of this other documentation, and we believe that this documentation was created to respond to the audit. And I have to go back and say, hold on. Did you actually take a look at the date of the documentation? It precedes any of the requests, okay? But if we have submitted documentation that was created after the audit, and this is a big mistake, and Eric and Stephanie, I know you both can speak to this. Once a date of service is under investigation, either for audit or investigation for fraud, waste, or abuse, any manipulation of that documentation, addenda, late entries, corrections, revisions, could be considered a False Claims Act violation. That's why when we do something, we separate our clinical summaries. Because a lot of times, like I'm going through this right now with the UPIC, where the UPIC was asking for psychiatric records of these patients. Well, psychiatric records under the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act are held to a much higher standard than your garden variety general practitioner's medical records for diabetes, hypertension, COPD. So what I've explained to the UPIC, and we had to go through the motions, and they finally came back, and this is when that supervisor got online and was like, hey, man, I got what you're saying. I get it. Let's try to figure out how we get around this the right way so my clinical review team can do what they need so we can turn this investigation, into a closed matter and figure out how to go from there. We do clinical summaries. Clinical summaries are an overview of the episode of care. It provides insight into the clinical judgment of a provider. Because let's face it, 99% of the people that are reviewing claims documentation are not clinical people. They don't have an MD/DO, and if they do, they don't necessarily have the requisite skills of the specialty that they're auditing. I love when I get on and I say to the nurse reviewer, from either TPE or from the UPIC when they bring one online. What's your background? Well, I'm an RN. Okay. In what area did you practice? Well, why is that relevant? Well, it's relevant because we're reviewing rheumatological claims, or we're reviewing orthopedic surgery claims, or we're reviewing neurosurgical claims, or oncology infusion services for high risk infusion. If you tell me that you were a pediatric nurse, or you tell me that you were working for a podiatrist, or worse, as I've had had happen in the past, a dentist, we've got serious problems. But you bring up a great point, Eric, because the MPIM, which a lot of people don't really understand how to use it, the Medicare Program Integrity Manual is designed to provide guidance under the Code of Federal Regulations, and in some instances, just best practices or requirements under Medicare law that drive how a UPIC, a RAC, a MAC, or a SMRC are supposed to conduct themselves. There's very specific language. For example, Chapter 3, Section 3.2.1.1 specifically talks about the requirement for credentials to be produced of the individuals, which talks about the medical record, the performing reviews in accordance with their medical record capabilities, right? Which means they have to have requisite skills in those areas. And then there's Section D in that section under 3.2.1.1 that says the maintaining of a credentials file. Now, segregate that from the Medicare Benefit Policy Manual, which is specific to providers, which tells providers this is what you're supposed to do as part of your conditions of participation with Medicare. This is how you bill for, like in Chapter 15, 60.1, Incident to Billing Services, right? Or provisional services. So, be smart when you receive and this is the last thing I'll say, unless there's additional questions for me on this topic. Be smart. When you get a UPIC letter of investigation, reach out immediately. Find a healthcare centered attorney, Robert Lyles, Amanda Wesh, Ashley Morgan, Ron Chapman, Jenna Milliger, all of these individuals who have very specific names in our industry. And I'm probably, my mind's going blank, but Gina Singleton and, Andrew Feldman, and
there are lots.
There's so many. David Parado, all of them.
You can't go to the lawyer who put together your rental lease.
That's right.
You can't
for
go
your
to the
divorce.
lawyer. Yeah, I mean, and
the fourth one.
We've all seen that. Like, that's the crazy thing, is that we've seen instances where the provider has an investigation going on, and the lawyer representing them is a former AUSA who worked in counterterrorism and doesn't know the first thing about healthcare or false claims or whatever, or a lawyer who's a municipal lawyer who helps set up an LLC for the provider or something like that, where it's like, just because you've passed the bar and you're a lawyer doesn't mean that you have omnipotence in all things relating to all legal areas. I mean, we all know lawyers who know everything that there is to know about municipal shoplifting cases, but they don't know anything about anything else. And I mean, the lanes are the lanes. And I think, Sean, that's the biggest thing is, you got to have the right person doing that requisite inquiry for you, the legal, piece of it. It just can't be because this dude down the street, helped you create your LLC and your rental agreement, doesn't mean that they know the first thing. And I say this all the time in the kickback space, you'll see a lease agreement where a real estate lawyer will say, oh, this is fine, it meets all the points. A healthcare lawyer might say, oh, no, you're renting a broom closet for $3,000 a month. A real estate lawyer, right? A real estate lawyer,
you're right.
Say, Man, $3,000 for a broom closet. You're setting a new record in the real estate market. A real estate lawyer is going to be, hey, this is great. It's, whatever.
Yeah, but they don't understand fair market value or commercial reasonableness.
A healthcare lawyer is going to say, well, hold on a minute. The OIG has a monograph out. They've got a calculation. It's not commercially reasonable. There's no FMV. A real estate lawyer and a healthcare lawyer are going to look at the same document with inordinately different opinions of things. And that's where it comes down to, you can't bring a knife to a gunfight.
Well, and a lot of times I find when we have practices that bring us in late, a lot of times their options are taken away at that point. We're forced up against the wall because they have already, gone through 1 round, 2 rounds, and then they're reaching out afterwards when they realize like, oh, this isn't going away, or now they're asking for lots of money or whatever's happening. And there's a lot of times the attorneys we're working with are like, okay, well, this is your option at this point.
Yeah. Stephanie, it reminds me of an OIG investigation that you and I were brought into in Ohio years ago, where they had the opportunity and the law firm said to them, get these guys and gals involved now on the front end. And they looked at it and said, no, the cost is high. Let's just kind of, submit our documentation. We think we're going to be fine. And then all of a sudden it was a $1.2 million assessment by the Office of the Inspector General. And they said, oh, heck, get, doctor's management involved. And you and I jumped onto the case in the 11th hour. I wrote a report with your assistance that we tried to explain to the client, hey, once the OIG, and Eric, you know this as a former investigator or a retired investigator. I don't want to call you former. That has an ominous tone to it.
Former, there's an implication of some malfeasance there.
That's right.
Former.
Well, it is you.
It is true.
But here's the thing. People don't understand, Eric, and you could confirm this as a retired investigator for the OIG. Once a report is written, even if it has errors in it, OIG is not changing that report. Once the report is done, the report is done. You had the ability to appeal to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is what we had to do. And what was really interesting was the OIG, when we submitted our report, the OIG came back with a rebuttal and said, while, Mr. Weiss and doctor's management pointed out, concerns and what they perceived as flaws or errors in our report, we disagree with him, blah, 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 blah. But what happened a month later? The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services overrode the Office of Inspector General and threw out the entire thing because they failed to comply with the program integrity manual. And it was a fatal flaw. There were several fatal flaws, but this is why it's so critical. And, I'm not the person that pats myself on the back, but I will tell you, and my wife will tell you, 99% of the things that I do in my life, I'm not very good at. The one thing that I am very good at is my job because I'm obsessed. I read at least 3 hours a day before I even start my actual work. I read the program integrity manual. That's what I read for fun. I read the benefit policy manual for fun. I read all of these things that are going out. That's why I write 2 times a week and I blog about all this stuff that I'm reading about. People need to understand you can't sit on this stuff, and you can't be, when you call me on the back end or you call Eric, the costs are exorbitant. They're exorbitant because I promise you are not paying for our good looks and charm. You're paying for our knowledge. You're paying for our experience. You're paying for our access to individuals within these organizations that we can have meaningful dialogue with to try to come to an amicable resolution. And that's why oftentimes the attorneys will say to me, I need you to use whatever influence you have with so-and-so at somewhere to try to bring them to. Stephanie's been on these calls with me hundreds of times.
Mhm.
Sean, who can you call within this agency that you can talk to? Eric, I haven't worked with you in a while on any cases, but I'm certain that people look at you and they go, as a retired, special agent from the Office of Investigations, this guy, I want to hire him because he probably has connections. He has a way to backdoor conversations, and he can bring meaningful dialogue to, this discussion.
It happens frequently. I'm working on something right now where, there's some stuff going on in a district that I did a lot of work in, and I happen to know the AUSAs that are working on it, and I think that they're barking up a little bit of a wrong tree, and we've been trying to resolve there's some issues that are there, but the problem is that once the ship has sailed, it's too late. It's too late, and that's why you've got to get in front of these things early, and that's why these living compliance programs are the number one thing. And I remember a practice came to us for something, and they said, well, if we looked at 5 records once a year, would that be good enough? And I said, good enough for what? That is my question. And it's a legitimate question. Good enough for what? If you're trying to check a box, I don't know if that even checks a box, but and the answer, their follow-up question was, well, what's the right number? And I was like, well, we have to know how many providers you have in your practice. What's the volume of claims? But you should at least be putting providers on a cadence where you're at least looking at their records once or twice a year. And they were like, well, why do we need to do that? And my answer is, because if you have a problem, isn't it better to find that problem in month 2 or 3 than at the end of the year? If you have an overpayment, wouldn't you rather pay back $3,000, fix the problem, and not have it again versus having to pay $50,000 or $100,000? Or more importantly, find that somebody has identified within your business that you've been doing this for years, and the next thing that you know, you have a key tam that's been filed against you for millions and millions of dollars. Like, I say this all the time, but I think the problem is that providers are a penny wise and a pound foolish. They're looking to step over a nickel to find a quarter that doesn't exist, and and not thinking in these terms. And I think the bigger problem is that they believe, I truly believe this, Sean, I think they believe that when they bring in an Advise Health or a Doctor's Management or a Stephanie Allard, that this is a $100,000 investment. And it's not. There are very, very cost-conscious ways. And I know the 3 of us talk about this all the time. I say it all the time. I talk myself out of business all the time. I know that you guys do, because the work is always going to be there. And I think that if people are so financial centric about spending the money for compliance, where that's going to come from, at the end of the day, a culture of compliance, particularly in today's environment, it's not optional. And at the end of the day, the only loyalty that an employee has is to themselves and their paycheck. The days of people working 20, 30 years for an employer and having abject loyalty do not exist. And so at the end of the day, is part of that culture of compliance to prevent you from having $1 million overpayment and having to deal with a UPIC or an SIU and lawyers and that? Yes. But is it also, to some extent, creating a insulation and a belt and suspenders approach to protecting yourself from your own, getting out of your own way, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk on this topic, because, even just in the past month, if we look at what's been coming out of the CMS newsroom, we have all of these, updates coming out about what they are proposing they're going to be doing starting next year, or, what they are finding or what they think they have found or estimating to have found. And, one of the things that worries me from my perspective and what I do helping practices most of the time, and by that I mean on the provider side more so than the payer side, but one thing that worries me is that when we see an increase in things like related to risk adjustment and diagnoses, that has to trickle down somewhere. And we know that there's going to be a lot of errors found just based on all of the disconnects that exist when we think about, a patient encounter all the way to a MAC or not a MAC, but an Advantage plan submitting that data to the government for payment. There's a lot of issues in that entire cycle. So this is going to trickle down somewhere. The payers are not just going to take a hit and say, okay, let's move on. This is fine. As the government gets more aggressive, we're going to have the payers getting more aggressive. And, we're already seeing a lot of it at this point, especially after the pandemic. So any last words before we wrap up related to really just staying on top of it and being prepared? Oh, Sean, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I guess in my final words, I just wanted to direct these to Eric. You don't bring me flowers. You don't sing me love songs. You hardly talk to me anymore when you come through that door at the end of the day.
Baby, I remember when you used to say you loved me and you used to hate to leave me.
Oh,
I mean, listen, when we started, I learned how to laugh, but now I've learned how to cry.
I cry. Look, it's always a treat getting to spend time with two of my very good friends, Stephanie Howard and Eric Rubenstein. When Stephanie asked me to do this and she told me that Eric was also going to be part of it, I immediately said absolutely. I couldn't wait to do it. Unfortunately, we had to delay it one time just due to scheduling conflicts. But as always, a great conversation. Stephanie, you got a great podcast. I love supporting it. I love supporting you. I think you hit a segment that has zero interest in Eric and myself. And I think, you're doing a fantastic job, and I'm so proud of you. Every single day I see the things that you're doing, and just keep up the great work.
Thank you.
Well, at least one of the three of us don't have a face for radio.
That is true. That is true.
All right. Well, I thank both of you, both very good friends of mine, for joining. And I hope everybody has a good rest of your week and join us back next week.